Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is Illusions Part 3. In this lecture, we're going to try to do two things. First, we're going to look at artists, who, very much like scientists, surprisingly, have to control for illusions all the time in their work, taking advantage of them in some cases, and in others, controlling and suppressing others that might be problematic for their work. Second, we're going to ask the ultimate question we've been driving at in all of these illusion lectures and phenomenon lectures, which is there a way to control for illusions to get to the essence of causation, the essence of what a phenomenon is? Now, let's back up for a minute here and see what it is that we are doing in the grand scope of our risk analysis. To refresh our memories, risk is the probability that a stimulus causes a harmful effect. This is the definition we're working with in most circumstances. Operative in this statement is that causation has to be known. And what we've also said in the past, and we'll say again in the future, is causation is a change in a stimulus that determines a directional change in an effect. Now, determination and directionality, if we were to put these words in a vertical stack here, are concepts that we will describe in a future lecture. Right now we're talking about phenomena, or the Latin word relata, same thing. The stimulus and the effect. How do we know that these phenomena actually exist and that we're not just chasing an illusion? Because if a change in an illusion is occurring that determines a directional change in another illusion, we don't know causation, and it's not really a risk. We're chasing phantoms. So, let's get started by looking at artists today. Artists have to deal with illusions all the time. And in some ways, they are as good as mathematicians or scientists at intuitively recognizing the nature of illusions. It wasn't always that case. Artists had to discover a lot of the things about illusory portrayals that make things seem realistic. For example, the horizon line in two-dimensional paintings. To portray 3D images requires that 2D paintings understand perspective, and that if a top of a column is slightly smaller than the bottom, and there's a horizon line, some distant point, the vanishing point of the image exists. And in that, we can create three-dimensional perspective, just as this diagram portrays here, where VP stands for the vanishing point on the horizon line at a distance where the column is slightly narrower at top than at bottom, to give the convincing impression that this is in fact a three-dimensional column, although it's only a two-dimensional portrayal. Now, it wasn't always the case that this was done this way. Back in the 1000s, this Bayeux tapestry, which portrays the Battle of Hastings of 1066, was in fact a very crude, rudimentary portrayal, and it only is really a two-dimensional set of images. We don't see in this portrayal very much three-dimensionality at all. In fact, it looks like stick figures and very simple cartoon-like portrayals in this case. That starts to change in the 1300s as the Renaissance takes place. Giotto, in The Mourning of the Christ, portrays Jesus' death and the adoration by the angels of him. And notice that the angels do seem to have a certain amount of levity and floating suspension in space here, that the people around Jesus seem to have some perspective and some amount of three-dimensionality to them. Now, admittedly, it's not perfect, but it's certainly a far cry and much better than this that we saw in the Bayeux tapestry. This improves in the 1400s. Here's the crucifixion of Christ. Look at the dimensionalities of these paintings. Compare this even to Giotto, and notice in 100 years how much the artists have improved in their recognition of how to portray 3D images in 2D space. If we go on even 50 to 70 years further, here's Matthias Grunewald and his portrayal of the crucifixion. Notice how much more detail there is in terms of three-dimensionality, how persuasive and realistic this has become, even over a 50-year period from before. We see this remarkable leap in the ability to suspend reality in the illusory portrayal of 3D imagery. And that goes down to the slightest details. Here's the hand and the feet in that painting of crucifixion. And notice how shading, perspective, and dimensions are also realistically portrayed in ways that even 100 years earlier couldn't have been imagined. Artists understood illusions, but only over time. And as they became more proficient understanding which illusions there were, they became more proficient in using them to create lifelike, realistic portrayals. Raphael, of course, took this to a height even just 5 years after that last crucifixion painting you saw. Here's the famous School of Athens. And look at the fantastic detail and the fantastic ornamentality, perspective, and depth that he has portrayed here in this scene. This does not just relate just to 2D imagery, however. Architects, too, figured out that three-dimensionality could be drawn into the stones of churches. On the left, you see Romanesque-style architecture. Notice how heavy it is. It's weighty, imposing, dark, and a little foreboding. On the right, by contrast, you see a Gothic cathedral coming a few hundred years later. And notice how airy and light it is, even though it's probably twice the height of the previous painting on the left of the Romanesque. Suspended high above the pews, you see the ceiling, which is airy and light and gives a sense of floating and perspective. By using buttresses and other masonry techniques, cathedral builders were able to recognize how to use certain techniques to create the illusion of lightness, even in the heaviness of stone. Of course, this is advanced in modern ages to even more remarkable marvels. Here's the Eiffel Tower, a marvel of its time, where suspended high above the city of Paris, simple thin layers of metal were able to create such a masterpiece. Here's another one that we might see is in Barcelona. And in Barcelona, this is a cathedral that mimics, by Gaudi, the cathedrals of the Gothic period. But notice how it too takes into account lightness and airiness and playfulness in a three-dimensional space. Here's the interior of that cathedral, again, mimicking Gothic style, but in a very modern, fresh way that takes into account the delight of the eyes in seeing all of these different ornamentalities suspended from the ceiling and the walls and so forth. Of course, one of the masters, true greats at understanding illusion was M.C. Escher. I'm sure you've seen his paintings somewhere. Escher was a master at taking what was implausible and making it plausible. Here, for example, is the impossible, never-ending staircase. Take a look at this for a moment. If you look at it, in some perspectives it looks like it's always ascending. In others it looks like it's always descending. Is this staircase actually physically buildable? You be the judge for a moment. Here's another portrayal by Escher. Look at the impossibility of this building. You have a ladder starting in a vertical projection that crosses up with two different axes of building, one vertical axis and one horizontal axis. And yet, in some plausible portrayal here, Escher has made this building look like it's something you really could build. In fact, if you take this exact thing and build it in Legos and photograph it at just the right angle, you can actually make yourself think that this building could be built, when in fact, it's not really possible. This too is just an illusion by photographing at just a certain angle. Here's another example of the never-ending staircase by Escher, always going up or always going down depending on how you look at it. Do you notice that that would be impossible to build? Or is this in fact plausible? Here's the Escher staircase done in a computer simulation model for you. Take a look at it. Let your eyes run clockwise or counterclockwise, doesn't matter which way. If you go clockwise, letting your eyes pan in a circle that way, you'll notice it looks like the stairs are always going down. Conversely, if you pan counterclockwise, it looks like the stairs are always ascending. This is just a visual trick. Of course, there's no such thing as a perpetual staircase, and yet it's quite subtly impressive upon the eyes that it might be possible. Here's an example of a perpetual waterfall. Here's a nice one by Escher called Convex and Concave. If you look at the left half of the painting and the right half of the painting, one is concave and one is convex, and yet there's a plausibility that it's all one portrayal of one building. Escher was aware of illusions, highly aware. In fact, here's a great quote from him where he says, "By keenly confronting the enigmas that surround us, and by considering and analyzing the observations that I have made, I ended up in the domain of mathematics. Although I am absolutely without training in the exact sciences, I often seem to have more in common with mathematicians than with my fellow artists." Escher understood illusion. He understood how to suppress it and when to take advantage of it. And indeed, we have to do the same when we're talking about risk. To be proficient, we need to understand which phenomena exist and when we might be being tricked by our senses. So that brings us to the final part of today's inquiry, the second half of what we're going to talk about, which is how much can we trust our senses or the tools that we use as being reliable to overcome illusions? The answer to that to some extent depends on the context of inquiry for that sense or tool. Take the following story, which I love, by H.G. Wells, The Country of the Blind. Here's an excerpt from that story involving a man who lives in a country where he's the only person with sight. Everyone else is blind. And the blind people are very disturbed because he's seeing things that they can't see, and he's describing things to them that they can't understand. And so here's a commentary based on that. "His brain is affected," said the blind doctor. The elders murmured assent. "Now, what affects it?" "Ah," said old Jacob. "This," said the doctor, answering his own question. "Those queer things that are called the eyes, and which exist to make an agreeable depression in the face, are diseased in the case of Nunez, in such a way as to affect his brain. They are greatly distended, he has eyelashes, and his eyelids move, and consequently his brain is in a constant state of irritation and distraction." "Yes," said old Jacob, "yes. And I think I may say with reasonable certainty that in order to cure him completely, all that we need to do is a simple and easy surgical operation, namely to remove these irritant bodies. And then he will be sane? Then he will be perfectly sane, and quite an admirable citizen. Thank heaven for science," said old Jacob. It's a great story. And in this case, Nunez is seeing things that are actually birds and describing them as such, but everyone else thinks they're angels because nobody can see anything, they only hear. And so this is a parable about who is in fact true. Remember earlier in a previous lecture when we were talking about phenomena versus illusions, I gave you a quote from one of my former students when we were asking, is the world flat or is it round? Where the student said knowledge shouldn't depend upon another's individual's ability to confirm the truth of the belief, because this is impossible anyway, since everything appears, and here's the important point, is different to everyone. Is it really different to everyone? Or did the angels really exist, or were they birds? Could they have been angels for some people and birds for others? Is the truth multi-sided? Or is there really a truth and some people simply perceive it and others fail to? Remember, the courts believe there's a truth we're supposed to pursue. So does science, you'll see in a moment, and so do many artists. But there's a general malaise among the public that we just can't know anything. And I think if we take that attitude, we're doomed in our estimations of risk assessment and risk management. In other words, if we say our tools are defeated from the start, that we can't know anything, aren't we getting into trouble? Here's the problem, if I were to summarize it in a different way. If we say that all reality is relative and subjective, and that there might be some true reality, but a lot of people see illusions and hallucinations, and we can never tell what. Is it the case, maybe, that Van Gogh in our Starry Night painting was not hallucinating when he took Thujon, and maybe we all are hallucinating by not taking Thujon? Maybe Van Gogh was the only person who saw the true sky, and the rest of us are seeing an illusion. Or maybe Nunez really was distressed by his eyes in the Land of the Blind story I just read you, and those birds really were angels, and should he then have his eyes removed? Maybe McGurk in that da 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 video that we saw in the last class was really saying da, and the man was lying to us when he was trying to trick us all by saying, no, I was mouthing ga and saying ba. Or, remember back to the first lecture in this series, maybe these really were painted horses we were looking at in the zoo and not zebras. Or really, to cap things off, maybe the earth is flat after all. as the supreme leader of Saudi Arabia has said as recently as 1993. If it's all subjective anyway, and there's no truth and no objective knowledge, does the fact, let's say I make up a ridiculous hypothetical here, but I will usually be punished for intentionally pushing someone off a building, even if I subjectively believe that person might fly away, does that mean all law is just Machiavellian? Might makes right, the common sort of wisdom is what prevails, and there's no truth to be found, even if that truth is unpopular? I want to suggest what John Searle has said. He's a famous philosopher in the late 20th and 21st centuries. And John Searle says there's no such thing as a scientific world. Science is not a perspective on life like cultural perspectives or gender perspectives, race perspectives, artistic perspectives, literary or political perspectives, or even regional perspectives. Instead, he says there is just the world. And what scientists are trying to do is to describe how that world works and what our situation is in that world. Searle goes on to say that when we come up with scientific facts, those are facts for everybody, not just scientists. His quote is nice here. He says, people sometimes speak of the scientific worldview as if it were one view of how things are among others, as if there might be all sorts of worldviews, and science gave us just one of those. In one way, this is right, but another way, he says, it's misleading. Indeed, it suggests something false. It is possible to look at the same reality with different interests in mind. There's an economic point of view, an aesthetic point of view, a political point of view, and so forth. But science, he says, does not name a domain of point of view. It names a set of methods for finding out about anything at all that it discovers that admits of systematic investigation. He says a scientific fact once discovered is not the property of science. It is entirely public property for everyone. So if we are interested in reality and truth, he says, there is really no such thing as scientific reality or scientific truths. There are just the facts that we all know. Notice the problem that comes up is people say, well, there's all sorts of conflicts in science and nobody knows anything. That since science has its own conflicts, it must be the case that all views are equally valid. Here's what Searle has to say about that, which is also an important point. He says, there are frequently debates about the reality of the entities postulated by science, but either they exist or they do not. The fact that hydrogen atoms have one electron is a fact like the fact that I have one nose. The only difference is that for quite accidental reasons of evolution, I do not need professional assistance to discover that I have only one nose, whereas it takes a good deal of our structure and the structure, given our structure and the structure of hydrogen atoms, it takes a good deal of professional expertise to discover how many electrons there are in a hydrogen atom. So just because there are debates in science doesn't mean science isn't getting us truth. Where does this leave us? Well, I think we need to take into account that if tools are defeated, if our senses are defeated, or the measurement tools that we're using to try to determine whether something is a phenomenon or an illusion needs to be taken into account with some specific context. Remember back when we were talking about Mike Humer's principle of phenomenology. You may presume things are the way they seem to you. It seems I have two hands, therefore I have two hands. That may not always be sufficient to say I have objective knowledge. Why is that? Well, it's because the tool that I was using, including the 5 traditional senses that we have as humans, in a particular context of inquiry could be defeated. A tool is not reliable if it creates an illusion or hallucination, or if it does not dispel existing illusions or hallucinations that otherwise exist. So, sometimes a tool, for example, vision, generates objective knowledge. In the story of the Land of the Blind, Nunez was seeing birds, not angels. But sometimes it can create an illusion. For example, in the McGurk effect, by looking at someone's mouth, while we heard the sound, we were confused about what was actually being said. Or a hallucination. Vincent van Gogh and the Thujon he took when he licked his brushes caused him to see things that weren't really there. So at the end of these lectures, we're left wondering, how do we overcome this measurement bias for things that are phenomena? How do we avoid illusions corrupting our data and corrupting our sense of risk? How do you know, in other words, that your beam counter, your electron microscope, your eyes, your ears, your taste, or some other sort of sense is in fact working correctly? There's no perfect answer to this, but there are steps we can take to try to mitigate the risk of illusion. First, whatever tool or sense it is you're using should be calibrated. Test it in obvious circumstances where it's known to work reliably, and then extrapolate from there to circumstances that are less certain. If it's not working in reliable circumstances, how can we expect it to work in unreliable circumstances? Second, observations with that tool in the context you're describing should be reproducible by others. Remember, Einstein said reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. If other people aren't getting the same results you are, that might be an indication that something's off in the way you're measuring. Third, new observations with whatever tool or sense you're using should reduce conflict in existing beliefs. That is, if we're making consistently true observations, then as we gain additional knowledge, we should be able to, in fact, reduce the misunderstandings that we have in our current knowledge or the conflicts that appear to exist. Knowledge that's ever expanding should, in fact, make things more, not less harmonious. And so these are 3 steps we could take to try to offset the power of illusions over our understanding of risk and causation. I want to suggest something to leave us off with today's lecture and to pick up with the next week, which is one other way which we might control for illusions rather than just knowing about them over time is to use probabilities and statistics to help us dispel illusions that we otherwise couldn't if we weren't precise and mathematical in what we're doing. And that will be important in our risk analysis story that we're going to tell later. So in the next class, we'll come back to this topic, concluding illusions, and trying to see, is there a way to make more precise measurement of reality, of the phenomena that are out there, trying to dispel the illusions that cloud our image. Have a good day. I look forward to seeing you on the chat boards.